The tales surrounding Abraham Lincoln run as tall as he was. He's often given credit for freeing the slaves, though his famous Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves only in those states that were fighting against the Union and permitted slavery elsewhere. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in the United States, was not something President Lincoln thought needed to end the Civil War. In fact, he said that if keeping slavery legal would keep the Union together, he would have kept slavery legal. Joining us to cut the Abraham Lincoln myth down to size is economist and scholar Tom DiLorenzo and historian Tom Woods. Guys, welcome back to Freedom Watch. Tom DiLorenzo, to you first. Make the case against the mythology that surrounds Abraham Lincoln.
Oh, well, Judge, you know, in Lincoln's first inaugural address, he pledged his support to enshrine slavery in the Constitution forever. And at the same speech, he used the words force, invasion, and bloodshed to describe what would happen to any state that failed to collect the federal tariff tax, which had just been doubled 2 days before his inauguration. Then he illegally suspended the writ of habeas corpus. He had the Army imprison tens of thousands of northern civilians without due process. This included duly elected members of the Maryland legislature, the mayor of Baltimore, and many newspaper men. He shut down over 300 opposition newspapers. Dean Sprague, the author of a book called Freedom Under Lincoln, said the only place there was genuine free speech in the North during the Civil War was in these prisons, where people were already in prison for speaking freely against the Lincoln administration. He deported a congressman from Ohio named Clement Vallandigham. And most importantly, you know, Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution defines treason as levying war against the states. Or giving aid and comfort to their enemy. And that, of course, is exactly what Lincoln did, levying war against the states.
Tom Woods, everything that Professor DiLorenzo has just articulated is well documented and cannot be disputed. But most people don't know this. Why is it that when Tom DiLorenzo goes through this list of historical facts about Abraham Lincoln, people start scratching their heads saying, I never knew this, I never knew this, I never heard of that?
Well, the Lincoln myth serves the purposes of the regime, both Democrat and Republican. It serves the purposes of a regime in which power is completely centralized, in which decentralization of power is viewed as suspect, and probably you want to bring back slavery, they suggest, if you favor the states having any powers. It's Lincoln who inaugurates this new version of the United States, a version that's completely at odds with its Jeffersonian foundation. So sure, if you want to exercise unchecked power over the American public, you foster these myths. But imagine, let's suppose we were governed by Walmart instead of the U.S. government, and every kid went into a classroom every morning, and on the wall were all the Walmart CEOs, and one day a year they had a special ceremony for the Walmart CEOs to acknowledge all their great contributions. We would sort of suspect that maybe there's something wrong with this. But when it's U.S. presidents up on the wall, our critical faculties go right out the window because these are our great saviors. This is beneath the dignity of Americans.
Tom, let's just take one example. I think for the first time in modern history, a government waged war on civilians. Lincoln's federal agents and Lincoln's soldiers actually targeted civilians in the South. These were not legitimate military targets. They were utterly undefenseless. They were totally innocent human beings. And yet we don't hear about this in the school books, and it's been whitewashed. Why has it been whitewashed?
It has been whitewashed, Judge, because that's the one thing we can't talk about. You know, according to historian Jeffrey Hummel, some 50,000 Southern civilians perished during the war, and that had to include many slaves and free blacks, by the way. And of course, if we start asking that question and teaching children about this in school and teaching adults about this, they'll begin questioning the Lincoln myth. After all, what kind of humanitarian could micromanage the waging of war on civilians, his own civilians, not foreign civilians, for 4 years? And that would bust up the whole myth, I believe, and that's why they're not taught this in the school.
Tom Woods, was Lincoln a white supremacist like many whites of his age? Or did he believe that blacks were equal to whites? Was he interested in liberating the slaves from the horrors of slavery in the South?
Well, I do believe that in his heart of hearts he was opposed to slavery. I take him at his word. But as Tom DiLorenzo says, he had other priorities. The Union was a greater priority to him. But in terms of his views on race, well, you know, his views on race were closer to those of the Ku Klux Klan than the NAACP. And he made this very clear repeatedly, and certainly in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, that he has not now, nor ever has he been, in favor of interracial relationships or blacks serving on juries or making voters out of them. And it's recently been uncovered because of some recent research, thanks to Dr. Phil Magnus. We now know that, contrary to the myth makers, Lincoln, to his dying day, was looking for ways to deport the freed slaves somewhere in the world. We're told that he had abandoned that and he had changed his mind because he was the great humanitarian. He wouldn't have had a view like that. We now know that's another bit of myth-making nonsense. To his dying day, he was of the opinion that they could not be assimilated into American society and needed to be deported. But if you question him, you're the one who's racially suspect.
Got it. Tom DiLorenzo, Tom Woods, thanks for joining us. Coming up.